My name is Joshua Keith, and this is theburningcoal.com, a website dedicated to God's glory, His grace, and our response to it. This week, what I'd like to do is start a series called Preaching from Jesus. Really, there's nobody better to listen to as a teacher than Jesus himself. He teaches in a variety of ways. He uses parables in order to make things easily understandable. He also can go into long discourses. He can have short little snippets like we see with the Beatitudes. He is willing to have encouraging phrases in teaching at times, but also to stand up against those who are living unfaithful, hypocritical lives like he does in Matthew chapter 23. And so it'll be good for us to go through and look at all the different teachings of Jesus and how they apply to us. The one I want us to start talking about today is one that we're all very familiar with. It's the idea of the Good Samaritan. And here in Luke chapter 10, Jesus goes into a teaching, a parable, and he's going to talk to a lawyer about what it means to be a neighbor to somebody. And that's really a key component to this discussion as we go through and we look at it. We see that there's this lawyer who comes and he talks to Jesus, and he asks a specific question. He says, "What shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And one of the ways that Jesus is a great teacher is sometimes he answers a question with a question, because most of the time they know the answer. And that is exactly the case with this lawyer. When the lawyer asks him, Jesus says, "Well, what's written in the law? How do you read it?" And the lawyer answers correctly. He says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And we see here, this is exactly what Jesus says when he's tested in another time, where he goes and they ask him, "What's the greatest commandment?" And Jesus talks about the greatest and the second greatest commandment. And his answer is actually the exact same thing that this lawyer says. So we know that this lawyer is on the right track. And Jesus follows that up in verse 28 by saying to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." And then in verse 29, we see the lawyer a little uncomfortable with his own answer. He says, "But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" It's really amazing the knots we twist ourselves into to try to avoid living what God tells us to do. He comes to Jesus, he asks a very straightforward question, "What shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus says, "Well, what do you think?" He gives his answer. Jesus says, "You are spot on." And while he was proud of knowing that right answer, he was unhappy because he knew that this did not reflect in his life. He understood that he was not treating people properly. And you can actually see him click through his mind as he's talking to Jesus. And again, he might understand from other accounts of Jesus and hearing things about Jesus that Jesus knew the hearts and minds of men, that Jesus knew what he had been doing in his life. And so he starts thinking through, and you can almost see it click in his head. Well, surely this doesn't mean Bartholomew. I mean, I hate Bartholomew. He's just such a jerk to me all the time. I shouldn't have to love him as myself, right? So I don't think hopefully Jesus doesn't mean this, because I don't want to do that. And so he asks Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" So Jesus, again, as the master teacher, we see him already having answered by letting the lawyer use his own knowledge to answer the question. Now Jesus is going to use a parable. And this is a parable that we're familiar with, or a lot of us are familiar with, but let's go ahead and read it again, because it's a very strong message, and there's a lot of good details in here that help us understand what's going on with the point Jesus is trying to make. "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? So we see Jesus use an example of a man who was traveling by himself. And it was dangerous to travel by yourself in these times because you were on the roads, and there would be these robbers who would wait in hiding, and they would try to come out and take money from people. And obviously, he may have put up a fight, and so he gets beaten up, and he was extremely injured. Jesus talks about leaving him half dead. So now, there's a priest who by chance is going down the road. And he sees this man, half dead. He may not even be sure that he's half dead. He may look bad enough that the priest thinks he's fully dead. But he doesn't do anything about it. Now, this is supposed to be the religious leader of the Jewish people. And he sees, one of his fellow countrymen sitting there in a ditch, injured, and he does nothing. We see a Levite who is a part of that chosen group that the priests come from. We see a Levite. He comes down and he does the exact same thing. And then we have a Samaritan. And just to put this in context, Samaritans were really the enemies of the Jews. We see this in John chapter 4 when Jesus comes and talks to the Samaritan woman, and she's surprised that he would deign to speak to her. And that really just sets the tone for what the relationship is between Samaritans and Jews. And so you have the priest and the Levite who are respected members of the Jewish community, and they ignore him. But the Samaritan comes, and he doesn't just ignore him, he has compassion on him. And he comes and he binds up his wounds. He takes care of him. He puts that oil and wine to be a treatment on him. And then he puts him on his own animal and takes him on to an end. So he knows that this man is not able of walking. He could have just said, well, I've done what I should. I helped treat the injuries, but there's not a room for both of us on my donkey here, and so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and go, and now he's taken care of. He'll probably come out of it just fine. That's not what he does. He takes it the next step by putting him on his animal. He guides the animal himself and walks to an inn. And at that inn, he then takes care of him even more, continues to treat his wounds and take care of him. And then he has the innkeeper take care of him as he travels on and says, I will pay you whatever needs to be done, just please take care of this person. And it's kind of interesting, again, you think about the different mindsets, and we talked about that with the idea of desiring to justify himself, how you could see him clicking through different excuses on why he should not love his neighbor. And when you think about the priest and the Levite, again, these were supposed to be the respected members, the leaders of the people of Judah. These are the people who are most fully associated with God's law. And so if God's law talks about loving your neighbor, shouldn't they be the ones who would do this? And yet they refuse to. And you can, again, picture some reasons or some thoughts that are going through their head during this time. You have someone who looks half dead on the road as a priest. If I touch a dead person, I become unclean. And I'm on my way to Jerusalem, and I'm supposed to be offering sacrifices and working around the temple and doing the work of God. I don't have time for this because I'm doing the work of God. And so he walks on by. A lot of times we may make excuses for not helping people. But the Samaritan, as he walks by, he doesn't make excuses. He doesn't care who this person is. He doesn't care why it's happened. He's going to take care of him. And we see that idea. He had compassion a phrase that's often used in the New Testament. A lot of times it's with Jesus having compassion. And that's why he does the miracles. That's why he feeds people. That's why he heals their ailments. And so it's interesting that Jesus uses that phrase, so often associated with him in the scriptures, that phrase of he had compassion. Because the Samaritan had that compassion on this stranger. Probably, again, the way this story reads is that this person who's been beaten down and is half dead, he was a Jew. And so, with the way the Jews felt about Samaritans, the Samaritan probably thought that if the situation was reversed, the Jew wouldn't do a single thing about it. But that doesn't matter. He goes ahead and he takes care of him. And he goes above and beyond. Again, he doesn't just take care of him for the moment, he goes above and beyond. And Jesus then switches the question around. In verse 29, the lawyer asks, "Who is my neighbor?" I'm going to read verse 36 again. Notice what Jesus says here. "Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" When Jesus talks about the idea of loving your neighbor, he means anybody. And what Jesus doesn't care about the definition of who your neighbor is. What he's more concerned about is who are you being a neighbor to? Because really everybody is your neighbor, if you love them as God has commanded you to love them. But if you don't, then you're missing the point of the law. And it's kind of interesting because in Leviticus 19 is where we see this command of love your neighbor as yourself. And in Leviticus 19, there's a lot of different things about how you need to treat other people. It talks about not stealing and bearing witness falsely, dealing falsely. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. You shall not do injustice in the court. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. At the very beginning of that section in Leviticus chapter 19, before it goes through all those things, it talks about something else. It says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edges. Neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare. Neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God." So in Leviticus, as God is giving the law about how it is that you are supposed to love your neighbor, one of the things he talks about is with your land, if you've been blessed to have your own land and you have your own harvest, that you leave the corners available, the edges available for people to come in and get their own food. And so this is their way of taking care of those who are poor, those who don't have their own land. They don't have the blessings that you do. They don't have their own land. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. You leave some of your food for them. But notice in verse 10 there that it's not just the poor that he talks about. It's also, "and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God." And one of the things that is often talked about in Leviticus is, be kind to the sojourner because you were sojourners. A very big theme of God's. What does all this mean? Why am I bringing this all up? It's pretty obvious that this lawyer understood the law of Moses. Not just because he was called a lawyer, although that does make it pretty straightforward, but because he knew the answer of what the law says about inheriting eternal life, of loving the Lord your God and loving your neighbor as yourself. He effortlessly combined Deuteronomy and Leviticus together by understanding that command. So I'm pretty sure that he was familiar with Leviticus 19, 9 and 10 before you get to later on in Leviticus 19 where it says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," talking about the sojourner. God has never made the idea of neighbor be limited even by nationality, even by the people that you live with. Instead, the sojourner, you're going to take care of them. You are going to love them by leaving extra food for them. That's food that you could have or that you could sell to make money for yourself, but you're leaving that for the sojourner. You love the sojourner because they are your neighbor, because you were a sojourner. And so, when we look at Jesus' response here, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? The question is not, who is my neighbor? The question is, who are we being a neighbor to? And in verse 37, the lawyer says, he said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, you go and do likewise. You go out and be a neighbor to those around you. And so, as Christians, we need to develop this mindset of looking for opportunities to help. It's very easy to try to justify ourselves and saying, you know what, I don't want to love this person because of what they've done to me. I don't want to love this person because, honestly, I'm really busy right now. Or I've got these other things going on. I really don't have time to show compassion. We can make all the excuses in the world. We can try to justify it any way that we want. But Jesus makes it very clear that we are needing to be about being neighbors to others, in showing them love, in taking care of them, in doing right by them. And so we need to make sure in our day-to-day life that we are showing that love, showing that compassion to people, that we aren't allowing grudges and bitterness to keep us from doing the things that we need to do for those people. And that we don't make excuses like maybe the Levite did for why he was just going to pass by that person. Again, one of the things that's really sad about the Levite is he was making all these excuses. And he was the one who was supposed to know the law. Same with the priest. They were the ones who were supposed to understand. If you see a sojourner or the poor, you take care of them. They should have known by the law of Moses what they should have done for this person. The love and compassion that they were supposed to have. But they made excuses. They did not do it. Let it be not said of us. I pray that God blesses you in the work of His kingdom.